Hi guys, it's Michael Hutchins from Modano, and today we're going to talk about scenario analysis. Now, scenario analysis is something that a lot of our clients include in their project finance, M&A, financing models, and to be honest, it's normally done pretty badly. So what we're going to talk about today is how you can do it in a modular, scalable way, really quickly and efficiently in any financial model. Okay, so let's dive in. Now, the best place to start to learning how to do scalable modular financial modeling with scenario analysis is just to go to the example models under the Modano tab and open one of our scenario analysis example models we've got in the system. So you'll see here we've got a couple. Let's open the incremental change sensitivities scenario analysis example. And you'll see when this opens, what's different in this model to every other model you're probably used to seeing as a generic starting point in Modano is that it contains a scenario manager right in the center. Now that scenario manager contains the ability to collect the assumptions for each scenario, but what's really powerful about this analysis, and I'm just going to turn off for a minute the data tables in this model so it goes fast. What's really powerful about this scenario analysis is that I can easily add new scenarios. So you'll see here I have a scenarios count assumption. I can add a new scenario and it will automatically extend this sheet to include, say, an IPO case. And now I can put some numbers in the IPO case. And you'll see if I now go to my scenario outputs, I'm going to enable my data tables. I go to my scenario outputs, and I now have an IPO case in there. So scenario is basically the ability to look at multiple scenarios and do side-by-side comparisons in your financial model without actually having multiple models. Now, the amazing thing about modular scalable scenario analysis is that we can add scenarios as I just did via the scenario manager, and they will automatically flow through into our side-by-side analysis in our scenarios dashboard. Okay, so in this case, you can see I've got the summary of each of the financial statements for the 4 different scenarios, including the IPO scenario that I just added. Okay, so the scenario manager here enables you to choose what your active case is. In this case, I've got the base case active, but if I now switch that across to my IPO case, you can see we've used conditional formatting to highlight where the active assumptions are. And I've now got sensitivity and revenue, which is coming through my sensitivity checks at the back of this model. And I can switch them off if I like, if I don't want the sensitivity showing throughout the model. But the benefit of leaving them on is you can tell when a sensitivity is active in a model, and it will show you exactly where it's coming from, which is here. Now, I like to use the base case as basically what's in the model case. So I like to leave that as all zeros, but obviously you could technically have scenario assumptions in every one of your scenarios. Now let's just have a quick chat about data tables, because data tables are a fundamental part of scenario analysis. And you can see here we have a large number of data tables at the bottom of this scenario analysis, the scenario manager. The data tables are in here because they provide you with the ability to have that side-by-side analysis that you can see on the scenario dashboard. If I go to my scenario summary, you can say I have the side-by-side analysis. Now, the problem with scenario analysis generally with data tables is things are very, very slow. Now, you've got a couple of options here. One option is in Modano, we allow you to actually disable your data tables. And what that actually does is that removes the data tables and just hardwires them temporarily. And then you can see if I go in and put in some expenses here, it's lightning fast. Now, I can then switch them back on and it will go and recalculate the data tables. And now they'll be live. Now, the problem with them being live if your calculation is on automatic is now if I go and put an assumption in, say 3% for salaries and wages, I have to sit here and wait while that calculates the whole way through the model. And the reason why it takes so long is because every data table is obviously calculating the model for every single cell in every data table. So if you've got, say, a data table with 5 rows and 5 columns, it's going to calculate 25 times. In this case, we've got a whole bunch of data tables, so it's actually calculating 12 times per data table times 4. So in this case, 48 times per data table. So you've got to make a decision. Now, what I choose to do is I disable data tables when I'm using the model and then re-enable them when I want to see the dashboard outputs. The other option you have is to go into your file options and just go to formulas, and you can choose automatic accept data tables. But bear in mind when you do that people may pick up your model, think it's calculating, and actually the data tables haven't calculated, which means your scenario summary dashboard could be not reflecting the numbers in the model. So what I choose to do normally is leave it on automatic and then turn the data tables off when you're using the model. But as you can see, you have a number of options available to you there. So now let's talk about how you build scenario analysis into a financial model. Now, in most cases, people think scenario analysis is a completely different type of financial model. The reality is it's not. It's a layer on top of a standard 3-way model. It doesn't even need to be a 3-way model. It could just be an income statement model, but it is a layer on top. And if you are actually embedding it in all the parts of your model, you're probably making a mess of it. So The best way to think about your scenario analysis is it literally is just a bunch of sensitivity assumptions being applied to your existing model. So let's assume I'd like to put scenario analysis into an existing model. So I'm just going to open an example model, and I'm going to open, say, an annual forecast model, just a basic chart of accounts one. Now this is a standard three-way model. It doesn't yet have scenario analysis. Now to convert this model into a scenario analysis model, all I need to do is insert from web and choose as the module the scenario manager. So you'll see I have a scenario manager now in this library as scenario manager, and I've got variable scenarios. So if I insert that module, you'll see it's going to put it right at the start alongside the time series assumptions. And the scenario manager is going to come in with some empty scenarios. So I can call this one base case. I can call this one upside, call this one downside. And then I can say add another couple. So I'll just say 5 scenarios. I'll call one of these hero and 0 case. And now I need to incorporate those scenarios in my model. So I need to go to the modules that I want to include scenario analysis in and say, okay, let's assume I want to include scenario analysis in this revenue module. All I do is I replace this revenue module with a revenue module of the same type. In this case, it's just got amounts, but I'm going to include scenarios. Now we'll discuss the different types of scenarios you can include shortly. Let's focus right now on just a basic one. So I'm just going to put in a percentage change scenario. So if I replace this existing amounts module with an amounts percentage change scenario, it's going to retain the assumptions. And now I have a scenario assumptions piece here. So I can now put in as my base case. I'll leave that as 0. Upside case, I'll do say plus 10%. Downside case, minus 10%. Hero case, plus 20%. 0 case, minus 20%. And I could do exactly the same thing with, say, my operating expenditure. So if I replace my operating expenditure from web, and I could choose an operating expenditure, I'll do in that one, I'll do say operating expenditure, say, I'll do say amounts, absolute change scenario. So I'm going to replace this, and I'm just going to put, say, for different cases, what have I got, about 5 million going to up to 8 million. I'll put in some assumptions for this. So I'll put in, say, plus, so upside, say negative 100, downside, say positive 100, and then I'll do hero, negative 500, 0, positive 500. Okay, now the issue I now have is that it's a scenario analysis model, but I don't actually have the ability to compare the different scenarios easily. I can obviously change the scenarios in here, and I can view the impacts on the financial statements doing that. But if I want to see them side by side, I really need to be able to see a summary of the different scenarios. And that's what the scenario summary dashboards are for. So if I go in and insert a module, I'm going to insert a scenario summary dashboard. And the scenario summary dashboard contains a summary and a side-by-side comparison of the different scenarios I've got in this workbook using data tables. Now, by default, the data tables will be switched off. They'll be disabled because they slow the model down quite a lot. So I'm going to switch them on. And when I do that, you'll see it calculates the model. And if I now go to my summary, I have in my scenarios dashboard, I now have my different cases, base case, upside, downside, hero, and 0. And I can see my cash is going negative in the worst 2 cases, which is going to be the downside case and the 0 case. And you can see my financial statements in the 3 different cases, and I can now print that out, and I've got a comparison of my different scenarios. So that's how you'd add scenario analysis to an existing model. Alternatively, you can start with a dynamic template, and you can just do new dynamic template from the Modano new menu, and you can just select the scenario analysis model you like with the properties you like, and that will just be a generic financial model with the scenario analysis modules in there. So if I chose, say, an annual, I'll do annual United States, see a single component here. If I open this, it will have the scenario analysis content in there for me. And you can see the speed issue I'm having there is purely because I have the data tables running now in both of these models. So now if I go to my scenario manager, this is an existing template. The data tables are disabled, but I now have full scenario analysis in this model straight away in the dynamic template. And that's how you get started building a scenario analysis model. Okay, so let's look at different scenario analysis methods. Now, every single scenario analysis model is very different, and that's why a lot of people up until now didn't think you could modularize them. The reality is you can, and every model, although it's different, contains similar components. Now, the most obvious form of similarity is the way in which different assumptions are collected for different scenarios. So let's have a look at some of the most common methods. Now, if you look at the model I have in front of me now, I have revenue scenarios being entered as a percentage change relative to each of the categories. And what this means is the NutriBubble sales, which if I go to my revenue assumptions, my NutriBubble sales here are 1950. And if I run the scenarios through on this, you'll see that the scenario manager, if I put this on, say, 10% upside in the upside case, and I run the upside case, all it's doing is applying, if I follow my hyperlinks through, it's applying a 10% upside on that to all periods. And this is what we call a percentage change scenario. Okay, and it's a basic percentage change scenario because it's applied to all periods of time equally across the model. So effectively, even out here, it's applying a 10% change. Now, if you'd like to change the way scenario assumptions are entered for different scenarios, you can go to the Modano tab and replace from web, and it will show you the modules we've included in the system. We are constantly adding new ones, but you can see at the moment we have lots of different. We have 4 different varieties. We have the absolute change scenarios, which is the same as the percentage one I showed you, but adds a dollar amount for every period in the entire model across all categories. And then we have quarterly absolute change and quarterly relative change. So let's assume you wanted to be able to run a scenario that, say, increases a revenue figure by 10% across the board, your revenue by 10% in a certain quarter. You'd change this to quarterly percentage change scenarios. You would replace this module, and when you put the module in, you'll see now it changes and it's going to restore some of the assumptions. So you can see now I've now got the same assumptions up here, but I've got the scenario coming through in each period. So if I now come through and say, okay, let's assume in March 2022, we have for 4 periods, we have, say, a 20% increase in revenue. I would come to March for this scenario that's running. I would come to March 22, and I would put, say, a 20% increase. And what this will do, and this has got a data table running at the moment, which is why it's taking its time. This will now come through to if I go to my revenues now, I now have that 20% coming through and being applied to all of those. And that's increasing that 5352 up to 6423, and that's that 20% increase. And if I now go to my scenario summary in my dashboard, you can see that that's actually reflected in my increase for the upside case. Okay, so when building scenarios, the first thing you should always think about when building a scenario analysis model is, do I have the ability to replace any of the existing models? Do I have the ability to replace any of the existing modules with existing modules that have functionalities that I can use instead of building it from scratch? Now, another type of scenario analysis model I'd like to show you guys, which is very common and a bit more complex than the standard incremental change scenarios, is scenarios within scenarios. Now let's have a look at what that means. So I'm going to go to the open example models, and I'm going to open an example scenarios within scenarios. And this is something that's done a lot in project finance, scenarios within scenarios. And what it actually means is, instead of, for my scenarios, if I go to my scenario manager now, instead of having revenue as adjustments, say percentage or absolute changes to categories, I have actually a selection instead of how I choose my scenario for revenue. And what that means is, if I go to my revenue now, I've got entire interfaces I can enter for each scenario. And the way this works in Modano, this is actually a revenue scenario manager that feeds into the central scenario manager. And what it means is I can come in, and I'm going to turn my data tables off for a moment to make this model a little bit faster, just while I do this. But what it means is, if I now go to my revenue scenarios, I can come in and say I'd like another scenario and enter another scenario here. And I'm going to put that scenario in. I'll enable this last scenario, say IPO. And I could just say, okay, if I wanted to, I could just go and grab the base case and multiply it by, say, 1.25%. Multiply it by 1.25. I'm just going to copy that across. So I'm just going to, just as an example, and I'm just going to paste those values. So now I have an IPO case, and now I can go back to my scenario manager and I can add another scenario case here and say, okay, give me another scenario. And and you'll see when I do that, I need to allocate for both my operating expenditure. I'm going to put that as the upside, and I can now select my IPO case for revenue, and it's gone through. So scenarios within scenarios are extremely powerful because you end up being able to specify very specific categories, and you can see which one's active here. And that at the moment we have in the scenarios, we have the base case active. If I switch to the IPO case, which is scenario 4, I can call this IPO here. And now I go to my revenue. You can see the IPO case is active with conditional formatting. And this scalable ability to bring in an infinite number of different scenarios at the click of a mouse is where modular development is so powerful. And if you look at my scenarios dashboard now, I can go back to my scenarios. I can activate my scenarios dashboard, and you'll see it's now calculating, getting rid of all the disabled text on the data tables. And if I now go to my scenario summary, I now have an IPO case in my model. And that's the power of the modular development, and it's also the power of what we call scenarios within scenarios. A really good example of scenarios within scenarios is when you're doing capital structuring on a project finance model, and you have a whole lot of different scenarios regarding your debt repayment or your equity returns and valuation analysis, where you might want to have a case where you show what would happen in 3 different scenarios with debt being swept away as opposed to paid via a credit foncia or a bullet. So the ability to put scenarios within scenarios adds a whole nother layer to scenario analysis. And it's something, once again, that's largely, the infrastructure is largely automated by Modano. And to learn how to do it, you really need to start by looking at this example model that we have in the system. Now, the reality is in most scenario analysis models, you are going to have to do some customization. The beauty and the fun of deals modeling is that you get to build all types of custom drivers and all types of custom scenarios. So even though Modano's got a couple of thousand scenario analysis modules in there, you're probably going to want to actually build some custom scenarios into some custom modules, or extend some modules that we haven't built scenarios into to have scenario analysis in them. So let's look at how you do that. Okay, so in front of me right now, I have a scenario analysis model that is the example model that just has revenue based on percentage change scenarios. Now let's assume I add another revenue module in here, but instead of including scenarios, I'm just going to put in here, say, insert from web, and I'm going to put in here revenue, say, amount and growth rates. And I'm going to put in that module. And I'm going to put this one in, and I'll call this module, say, new sales. So I'll bring this one in and I'll call this new sales, and that goes through, and I'll put in some random numbers on this, say 1,000. Now, this is a module for which I don't off the shelf have scenario analysis at the moment, and Modano doesn't provide scenario analysis for this particular module. We probably will by the time you're watching this video, but we don't at the moment. So let's have a look at how I can add scenario analysis into this. Now, there are lots and lots of ways I can do this. So I'll show you how to do it really, really simply. I can go back to my scenario analysis sheet. I can my scenario manager. I just right click. I just go to the build tab, or I right click and just do components, add below, select the new sales option, module, and then click OK. And this will add in here a new sales assumptions component. And that's what each of these are. The important thing to bear in mind, if I look at my project manager, the scenario manager, if you look at the scenario manager module, the scenario manager module is actually just, if I look at this, the scenario manager is just that top block of rows. Below that are components. So if I look at the revenue module in here, and I look at the components on this, that revenue module actually consists of a scenarios component and an assumptions component. If I double click on that scenarios component, that is the component there. Okay, so I can open that up and you can see that is actually the component. If I use cell block shading, you can see that I have rows around selection. You can see the scenarios. And that's why this is so perfectly modular. So the scenario manager doesn't contain all the scenarios. It contains the actual infrastructure that's used as a foundation for all the modules to have it. So in this case, to add scenario analysis to my module here, I would just come in, apply a heading 3 to this one, delete that block, and then I could come in and I could say, okay, what I'd normally do to do a scenario analysis piece is I would actually copy these pieces down, but you could just build them in. So I could just come in and go in here. Now you'll see the sensitivity check that I've got coming through there is just checking to see whether there are any live sensitivities. The active scenario is linking in from the scenario manager. And this is where the scenario manager is fundamentally important, because it actually has the applied scenario, and that allows for the data tables coming in from the scenarios data tables down the bottom. And this one here, the data tables are driven by whichever scenario is actually active in the data tables. So there's some real sophistication in the fact that when the data tables are running, they run through here without affecting the way the scenario manager actually works. Now this new sales assumptions here, I've just come in and I'll just rename that with dynamic text. I'll rename that module name and make that new sales. And here, I'm just gonna bang in this. I'm just gonna paste that link in. Now here, don't worry about that font. Don't worry about that. We'll fix that in a second. Now this here, this active scenario I brought in has actually brought in a link into the active scenario. So if I actually show my precedent links, which I can do with my precedent links pane, I can drag that in here. So now if I want to add scenarios to this, first of all, I'm just going to get rid of that for a minute because we don't want that to actually pick up any precedents. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring in the scenarios from the revenue module assumptions, the new sales module assumptions. And if I do that, that will bring in categories for each of these. And there they are. And then I can come in and do I'm going to do a percentage change. So I can do assumptions percentage, fill that right. And what I've actually been doing with these, what we've done with these modules is we've actually gone and put them as centered aligned, and you'll see we've actually put in here some special number formatting where we have a plus sign in there, and this go through and then put that in. And then we've got conditional formatting. So the easiest thing to do, you'll see that the rule we've got in here is rev active scenario. The active scenario we've named as this cell here. So I can name this one active scenario here. So I'm going to call this rev 2. This is going to be active scenario. And now when my conditional formatting comes in, the way we've used conditional formatting on this is specifically to capture what the active scenario is. So in this case, I'm going to add a new rule. I'm going to put, in this case, the rev active scenario is this cell here. And I'm going to make that equal J.4, which is the scenario number in the period titles. And then I'm going to put in my border. I'm going to put in my fill color as, I think, this one. Okay. And I'll bring that through, and then I just let that on. You'll see that's how we create that. So now if I switch the scenarios across to upside, it moves that across. And I've also captured here with my upside, I can now put in 10. I can now put in 10, and the 10% has the plus in it. And then all we need to do is add our index here. So you'll see here, I always just grab one of the existing ones. I'm going to put this through, and I'm just going to drag that down, change the index to this guy, and then fill that down. And then disable them. And now you see, now I can put this in. So what I often do with this is I'm just going to copy and paste formats to get that format down there. And now you can see if I switch across to, say, the upside case, my plus 10 comes through. And then I can just delete my empty rows. Make sure that's got a sensitivity check on there. And put a check in. Add sensitivity check. I'm going to make it linked to cell B31. That's fine. It's going to pick up new sales. And then I can add that. And when I add that, you now see I've got a new sales sensitivity check coming through. And if I switch this across to, say, oh, I need to add my sensitivity check, obviously. So again, always look for an existing sensitivity check where you can. So in this case, I'm going to take this sensitivity check here, put that in here, and just change that to these guys. And there's my sensitivity check, and I'll get rid of my precedent links window. And there's my sensitivity check. So now you can see I have in my new sales that sensitivity check active. If I switch back to base case, it comes off. And that is how, if I now go to my new sales, I'm just going to put an internal hyperlink in here. So I'm going to put a hyperlink, intercomponent hyperlink to new sales. And I'm going to put one here as well, just to go back. And now I can just put, a formula in here saying, okay, let me, this guy here, I'm just going to do for the first period, I'm going to open that up, and I'm going to say, if this equals 1, this multiplied by 1 plus, and I'm going to add this percentage here and make sure I lock the column. Otherwise this. So now you'll see if I come through to my scenario and I put, say, the upside case on, I've now got 10% coming through. And if I go to my new sales, I've now got the 110 coming through as a result of that. And if I view that with the traverse formula, you can see I've got if the first period multiplied by the scenario piece. And that is how you go about adding any form of scenario analysis to any module into your scenario manager in around about 5 or 10 minutes. The first time you do it, it's a bit tricky. Once you get used to it, it's actually really second nature. And the key is leveraging off existing modules, so you very rarely do anything from scratch.